The heavy thud of boots against the damp earth outside echoed like a countdown. Captain Sokolov didn't move, but his hand hovered near the holster of his Makarov pistol. He knew that the blue-tabbed uniforms of the NKVD's successors didn't visit remote radio outposts to share a drink. "Victor, the basement hatch, now!" Sokolov hissed, his voice barely a breath. Victor didn't argue. He grabbed the reel-to-reel tapes, the ones containing the rhythmic heartbeat from the stars, and scrambled toward the floorboards. As he descended into the darkness of the maintenance crawl space, the front door of the station was kicked open with a violence that shattered the wooden frame. "Captain Sokolov," a cold, precise voice rang out. "By order of the Special Committee, this facility is now under quarantine. You are to surrender all recordings from the 1400 frequency sweep." Through a crack in the floorboards, Victor watched as 3 men in long, dark coats entered. They didn't look like soldiers, they looked like morticians. Behind them, a technician carrying a strange lead-shielded device began scanning the room. The device emitted a high-pitched whine that set Victor's teeth on edge, the same frequency he had heard in the static. "There was nothing but atmospheric interference, Comrade Major," Sokolov lied, his voice remarkably steady. "The sunspot activity has been—" A gunshot cut him off. Victor jumped, nearly dropping the tapes. He saw Sokolov's body slump against the Telefunken receiver, his blood splattering the glowing vacuum tubes. The major didn't even look at the body. He simply adjusted his gloves. "Search the floor," the major commanded. "The signal was traced here. If the leak isn't contained, the Redshift project is compromised before the rocket even leaves the pad." Victor realized then that the door mentioned in the transmission wasn't a metaphor. The Soviet Union wasn't just trying to beat the Americans to the moon. They had found a shortcut that required a broadcast. As the men began tearing the station apart, Victor crawled deeper into the dark, narrow tunnels leading away from the building. In his hand, the tape felt unnaturally warm. He realized with a jolt of horror that the recording wasn't just audio anymore. The magnetic tape was vibrating, humming with a life of its own, echoing that same rhythmic heartbeat, thump, 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 thump. He wasn't just carrying a secret, he was carrying a beacon, and whatever was on the other side of that door now knew exactly where he was. The train moved like a ghost through the vast, frozen emptiness of the Kazakh steppe. There were no lights in the windows and no schedule on any station master's desk. Victor huddled in the corner of a freight car, hidden behind crates marked with the red star and the seal of Glav Cosmos. The air was so cold it turned every breath into a shroud. In his pocket, the stolen tape remained unnaturally warm against his thigh, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to beat in sync with the clicking of the rails. He had escaped the massacre at Zenit-4 by a miracle, catching the undercarriage of a military transport. Now he was heading toward the very source of the transmission, Object 7B. It was a place whispered about in the corridors of the Kremlin, a site so secret it didn't exist on any map, built over an ancient geological fault that the locals avoided for centuries. As the train slowed, Victor peered through a gap in the wooden planks. The horizon was dominated by a colossal structure that defied Soviet engineering logic. A massive launch gantry stood like a skeletal finger pointing at the stars. But it wasn't holding a traditional R-7 rocket. Instead, the craft was a smooth, windowless sphere of a dull, non-reflective black material that seemed to swallow the light around it. Surrounding the pad were rows of high-voltage towers, humming with a frequency that made the air shimmer like a desert heat haze. This wasn't just a spaceport, it was a massive tuning fork. Soldiers with Geiger counters patrolled the perimeter, and researchers in lead-lined lab coats moved with a frantic, desperate energy. They weren't preparing for a voyage, they were preparing for a sacrifice.
Victor slipped out of the car as the train hissed to a halt inside the high-security zone. He moved through the shadows of the hangars, his ears ringing from the intense electromagnetic field. He found his way into a secondary observation bunker where a group of scientists stood huddled over a bank of monitors. Among them was academician Lev Baranov, a man whose face was etched with lines of exhaustion and moral decay. Baranov was staring at a screen displaying a live feed from the interior of the Black Sphere. Inside, there was no cockpit, no controls, only a chair made of the same dark material and a series of glass jars containing a viscous silver liquid. "The medium is ready," Baranov whispered to a high-ranking general standing beside him. "The pilot is already half-phased. If we don't launch now, the feedback loop will tear the site apart."
"And the Americans?" the general asked, his voice rasping. Baranov pointed to a second monitor. It showed a grainy satellite intercept of a U.S. naval fleet in the Pacific, centered around a strange, dome-like ship. "They are watching. They can feel the rip in the fabric as well as we can. Their Argus project is a mirror of our own. But they lack the key. They don't have the recording of the first contact." Victor froze. He realized then that the tape in his pocket was the very thing they needed to stabilize the portal. The broadcast he had intercepted wasn't a message, it was a set of instructions on how to bridge the gap between dimensions. Without the specific frequency on his tape, anyone who entered that sphere would be scattered across the void, fused into the very vacuum of space.
Suddenly, an alarm blared across the complex, a deep, mournful siren that vibrated in the marrow of Victor's bones. The tuning fork towers began to glow with a sickly violet light. The ground groaned as the fault line beneath Object 7B reacted to the massive energy discharge. "Initiate the sequence!" the general roared. Victor saw the soldiers outside fall to their knees, clutching their ears as the air itself began to scream. He looked at the tape in his hand. He had a choice: destroy the recording and potentially stop the launch, or witness the moment humanity finally stepped through the forbidden door. But as he turned to run, the door to the bunker hissed open. The major from the radio station stood there, his silenced pistol aimed directly at Victor's chest. "Give me the frequency, Victor," he said with a hollow smile. "The stars are waiting for their answer."
While the Kazakh steppe groaned under the weight of Soviet ambition, 5,000 miles away, in a windowless room beneath the Pentagon, the air smelled of stale coffee and ozone. CIA analyst Thomas Miller stared at a sequence of thermal satellite captures that shouldn't have been possible. The Soviet site, designated Object 7B, wasn't just emitting heat, it was absorbing it. On the infrared scans, the entire base appeared as a perfect, freezing black hole in the middle of the desert. "It's a thermal sink, sir," Miller said, his voice cracking. "The laws of thermodynamics are being violated in real time. Whatever they've built there is drawing energy not just from the grid, but from the environment itself." His superior, Admiral Vance, watched the screens with a grim fascination. "They aren't just building a ship, Miller. They're building a vacuum cleaner for reality." The American response was Project Black Argus. Officially, it was a maritime radar research initiative. In reality, it was a specialized fleet positioned in the North Pacific, equipped with experimental etheric lenses developed by Operation Paperclip scientists. These lenses didn't look at light, they looked at the density of space-time. On the deck of the USS Argo, a massive geodesic dome pulsed with a rhythmic blue light mirroring the violet glow in Kazakhstan. The Americans had realized that the space race was a front. The real goal wasn't the moon, it was the subspace, a layer of existence where distance was irrelevant, but the cost of entry was sanity. "The Soviets have the frequency," Vance whispered, looking at a decoded intercept. "But we have the anchor. If they jump, we're the ones who decide where they land."
Inside the Argo's command center, Miller witnessed the first mirror event. As the Soviet towers in the steppe reached peak resonance, a corresponding distortion appeared in the Pacific. The ocean didn't just ripple. The water turned into a reflective metallic glass for 3 miles in every direction. Sailors on deck reported seeing ghost ships from different eras, galleons from the 17th century and futuristic white vessels flickering in and out of existence in the fog. The etheric lenses were pulling images from the folds of time. "We're thinning the veil," Miller warned. "If they launch that sphere, the ripple effect won't just hit the USSR, it'll wash over the entire planet. We're looking at a global synchronization of madness." Vance didn't flinch. "Then we ensure we're the ones holding the leash when the door opens."
The tension reached a breaking point when the Argus sensors picked up a secondary signal. It wasn't coming from Russia or the U.S. fleet. It was a localized burst originating from a small, unmarked radio station in the woods near Moscow, the very signal Victor had recorded. "Sir, the Soviet major is transmitting the stabilization code," Miller shouted over the growing hum of the equipment. "But the sequence is wrong. It's not a landing coordinate. It's an invitation." On the monitors, the black sphere in Kazakhstan began to vibrate so fast it became translucent. In the Pacific, the water beneath the Argo began to boil without heat. Fish floated to the surface, their scales replaced by a strange crystalline growth. The stellar blindness was beginning, a sensory overload that blinded radar and human eyes alike. "They're going through," Vance said, his face illuminated by the eerie blue light of the geodesic dome. On the satellite feed, a beam of pure darkness shot from the Kazakh gantry straight into the heart of the moon. Simultaneously, the USS Argo was hit by a massive gravitational wave that tilted the ship at a 40-degree angle. Miller fell against the consoles, watching as the ghost ships in the fog began to merge with the American destroyers. The screams of the sailors over the intercom weren't cries of pain, but of confusion. They were experiencing 2 places at once. The Cold War had just turned into a war for the integrity of the human soul. The Americans had tried to anchor the portal, but they had only succeeded in becoming part of the bridge. The horizon wasn't just moving, it was collapsing. The transition didn't feel like movement. It felt like being turned inside out. Inside the black sphere, now designated Vostok Omega, the Soviet pilot, Colonel Yuri Volkov, stopped breathing, not because he was dead, but because the air in his lungs had turned into something thick, sweet, and non-oxygenated. The interior of the craft had expanded. What was once a cramped 3-meter pod was now a cathedral of shifting geometry. Through the hull, which had become as transparent as a soap bubble, Volkov didn't see the stars. He saw the dead loop, a localized distortion where the Kazakh steppe and the North Pacific were folded onto each other. He could see the USS Argo floating directly above him, its geodesic dome screaming blue light into the same vacuum he occupied. "Moscow, do you copy?" Volkov tried to speak, but his voice emerged as a series of rhythmic clicks, echoing the tape Victor had recorded. The radio didn't bring him the voice of the general. It brought him the panicked transmissions of CIA analyst Miller. The 2 realities were bleeding together. Suddenly, a violent jolt rocked the sphere. The American anchor had worked too well. The USS Argo hadn't just watched the launch, it had been dragged into the wake of the tear. A physical bridge of solidified salt and frozen nitrogen had formed between the Soviet sphere and the American ship. They were docked in a place that didn't exist, held together by a gravitational knot that was rapidly tightening. "Collision imminent," a voice whispered in Volkov's ear. But it wasn't a human voice. It was the static. The airlock hissed. It shouldn't have. There was nothing on the other side but the void. Yet the pressure sensors leveled out. Volkov watched in frozen horror as the outer hatch warped, the metal flowing like wax.
Emerging from the shimmering air was a figure in a high-altitude U.S. Navy flight suit, but the glass of the helmet was shattered. Inside, there was no face, only a swirling vortex of the same silver liquid Baranov had prepared in the jars. This was the passenger. The Americans had sent their own pilot, not as a man, but as a biological conduit. The two experiments had met in the middle. "We are the bridge." The thing in the suit vibrated, its words appearing as text on Volkov's internal monitors. "The Cold War is over. The harvest begins."
Outside, the dead loop began to collapse. The ghost ships Miller had seen earlier were now being pulled into the sphere, their crews fused into the walls of the Vostok Omega. Volkov grabbed a manual override lever, his gloved hand trembling. He realized that the Soviet key and the American anchor were two halves of a predatory mechanism. The static wasn't a signal from an alien civilization, it was a biological broadcast from a sentient dimension that used the electromagnetic noise of civilization to find its prey. By racing to the stars, both nations had simply rung a dinner bell. The silver liquid began to leak from the American suit, crawling across the floor toward Volkov, mimicking the shape of his own boots as it moved.
"Miller, if you can hear this, sink the ship!" Volkov screamed into the void, hoping the cross-contamination of frequencies would carry his message to the Pentagon basement. He drew his service flare gun and fired it directly into the silver mass. The magnesium flare ignited, not with fire, but with a burst of redshift radiation. The sphere buckled. The connection to the USS Argo snapped, sending the ship plunging back into the Pacific. But Volkov and his passenger were left drifting. As the sphere began to spin into the deep black between dimensions, Volkov looked out one last time. The moon was no longer white. It was pulsing with a rhythmic emerald heartbeat. The door was open, and he was the only one left to see what was coming through. The aftermath was not a bang, but a systematic erasure. On the morning of the mirror event, every radar station in the Northern Hemisphere went blind for exactly 11 minutes. When the screens flickered back to life, the USS Argo was gone, replaced by a massive oil slick and a collection of crystalline debris that dissolved upon contact with air. In Kazakhstan, Object 7B was no longer a launch site. It was a crater of fused glass, silent and cold. The Redshift project was scrubbed from the Soviet archives within hours. General secretaries and presidents spoke over the red phone, not in anger, but in a shared, stuttering terror. They realized that the space race hadn't been a competition of strength, but a frantic attempt to build a cage for a shadow they had accidentally invited into their world. Thomas Miller sat in a sanitarium in Virginia 3 months later, his hair having turned snow white. He wasn't allowed to see the sun, and his room was lined with lead foil. "It's in the background radiation now," he told the faceless men who interviewed him through a speaker. "You can't just close the door. We thinned the walls of the world." He explained that the Apollo missions and the Soyuz programs were redirected, no longer intended for exploration, but for sealing. Every lunar module left behind on the moon wasn't a monument to human achievement. It was a sensory jammer, a desperate attempt to drown out the emerald heartbeat Volkov had seen. "We didn't stop going to the moon because it was expensive. We stopped because something there started recognizing our names." In a small village near the Ural Mountains, an old man who used to be known as Victor lived in a house without a single radio or television. He had burned the tapes, but the rhythm was etched into his nervous system. He could feel the static rising during every solar flare. He knew that the major had never found the frequency because the frequency had found the major. The silver liquid,
The passenger hadn't stayed in the void. It had hitched a ride back on the gravitational waves infesting the global communication grids. It lived in the white noise between stations, a dormant digital parasite waiting for the world to become sufficiently connected. "The more we talk to each other," Victor whispered to his shadow, "the louder we scream for it."
By the 1970s, the stellar blindness had been officially classified as mass hysteria or atmospheric anomalies, but the secret budget for signal intelligence tripled. Governments began moving away from analog systems, not for efficiency, but because the passenger found it harder to hide in the complexity of digital gates. Yet the warning remained. In 1977, the WOW signal was detected, a 72-second burst of radio energy. The public thought it was a sign of life. Miller, from his foil-lined cell, knew better. It was the same rhythm Victor had recorded in 1961. The dead loop was still active, and the thing in the American flight suit was still knocking on the other side of the glass, using Volkov's clicking voice to ask for re-entry.
The story ends not in the past, but in the present. As we transition to a world of total connectivity, the static has never been louder. Every smartphone, every satellite, every fiber optic cable is a strand in the web we've spun for ourselves, and a bridge for the passenger. The space race didn't end, it was just put on hold until we built a better vessel, us. Somewhere in a forgotten archive, a single reel of magnetic tape begins to vibrate in a lead box, humming with a sickly emerald light. The door isn't just open, we've forgotten it was ever there. And as the stars begin to pulse in that familiar rhythmic heartbeat, the only thing left to do is listen to the silence. Because once the static stops, that's when the passenger finally arrives.